Rob, welcome to Axel's Garage. Okay, we got a problem. We get in the hot dog truck here about 2-3 weeks ago, turn the key, and everything was running fine. Turn the key to start it to go to work for the day, and the starter sounded like it was banging against the flywheel. It just was making a bang. It would like give like a half a crank, and it was like clunking and banging. I didn't know what it was, so I took the key off, put the key back on, and every time I did it, the starter would make a horrible noise that sounded a little bit different each time. So I had the big dummy come out, had him get behind the wheel, and I crawled under so I could see what that starter gear was doing. And what it was doing was it would either bang against the flywheel completely, would not engage with the teeth on the flywheel, or it would engage into the flywheel, but it would get stuck out. It wouldn't come back in, so the clearance was really tight, or it would skip the gears completely, almost like it was moving around. I couldn't see any movement in the starter, so I figured that there was a problem with the starter and the starter was shot. This was an old used starter that we have in this truck because about 2 years ago the starter went normally like how a starter goes, and I had one in the garage from one of the Chevelles, and it was the same exact starter, so I threw it in and I've been using it ever since. And that was a real old one. Who knows how old it was, so I just figured it was a starter. So we didn't go to work that day. We went and got a starter and put a starter in, and when I put the new starter in, I saw something that nobody wants to see when they're changing a starter on a small or a big block Chevy, and that is a cracked ear on the block. So your starter bolts, you have two bolts that hold the starter in. One goes inboard right next to the oil pan, and the other one is an outboard, which is just as a little ear. The block kind of comes down to a point, and there's a little ear, they call it, on the block with a threaded hole goes through. And that is a spot that does break from time to time. And when I move the camera, I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about. So I saw that break, and I didn't think that that's why my starter was acting funny. I still thought it was the starter. So I bolted it in, turned the key, thing fired right up, went to work for a couple days, not a problem. Then all of a sudden on like the third or the fourth day, the same exact thing was happening. It was either banging against the gear or missing the gear completely or getting wedged. And what we determined what was going on was that crack in that ear, in that bolt hole, was allowing the starter to shift just enough to misalign the gear going into the flywheel. So what was our fix? Well, in the short term, which like most car guys becomes like a permanent solution, what I had to do was go underneath with a cordless impact is what I was using, and all I was doing was just giving them a little bit of loosen to the bolts to let the starter drop down just a hair, and then tighten it back up, and it would align itself where it's supposed to be, and I'd start up with no problem. And sometimes that would last 2 or 3 days before it started to misalign again. And it progressively got worse, where every time I started the car, I would have to get underneath, and which was a pain in the ass, because when I was done working for the day, I had to crawl underneath it on a busy road and just buzz that starter a little bit and then get back up and start. It was a nightmare, and I couldn't work when it was inclement weather, when it was rain or anything, or otherwise I'd be laying in water on the road. So I tried to figure out a way where I could get that starter to be a little bit more rigidly mounted, even though that outer bolt hole was letting the starter move a little bit. So I went out and got new starter bolts. Starter bolts are knurled. Got new starter bolts, put them in to see if they were a little tighter, maybe going through the starter, so there wasn't as much slop where the bolt goes through the starter, and that helped a little bit. Then I took them out and I actually wrapped them in like a medical cloth tape, just enough where I could still feed them up through to keep that starter tighter, and that helped. So what I did was I went over it with electrical tape so that medical cloth tape wouldn't deteriorate fast, and that actually helped. And I had like 4 work days with no problems with the starter, and eventually that started to go bad too. So trying to figure out what to do, went and spoke to some people, and what we're going to do is we're going to take an old school third mount, which is it's the back of the starter or towards the front of the motor, so it could be the front of the starter, but it's that mount that goes up to the side of the block, and I'll show you what it looks like. So now some starters, depending on the year, make, and model on these GM cars, had a had a mount that will go on the opposite end of the nose, let's call it, towards the front of the engine, and there's a stud that goes through the starter. Now, my old Chevelle starter didn't have that stud. This reman that I got from, I think it was Advance Auto, does have the stud coming out of the back of the, I call it the back end of the starter, but it's towards the front of the motor. And so you got this hole right here, would slide on that, and you'd bolt it on that, and you could see there's a little slop in it, adjustment up and down. And then this curve here is going to go up against the side of the block, and there should be a 1/4 hole in the block that this would go to. So we're going to go underneath the truck. We're going to see if we can get this thing mounted up there, and then give that starter another tighten. Hopefully it's in the right spot, and see if adding this bracket will give the starter itself a little rigidity as a semi-temporary fix. How do you fix that? Some people weld a stud to the cast iron, which is difficult at best, and getting it straight and in the right spot is difficult also. Short of taking that whole block out, and you know, people have replaced engines because of this broken starter pad, mounting pad tab, broken starter mounting pad, I'm going to call it. They've replaced engines because of this. So I have seen people weld in there. You don't always get good results welding a threaded rod to the cast iron of the block. It doesn't always hold that well. I don't know. I'm going to try this and see what this is. So let me take the camera off the tripod. We're going to crawl under the truck, and I'll show you what I'm dealing with. All right, so right up under the truck, you got your inboard bolt, which is good, the outboard bolt, which is having the problem, and then if you look right up there, you could see the part of the block that's misaligned because of the crack. I don't know how the crack is showing up on camera. I can get you in there. There's the crack in that ear of the block, and you can see it real good there. So now I have to try to figure out a way to do something, because this starter itself is just misaligning back and forth, and you can't even see it. Like, if you look right in there where the starter is against where the starter comes to the transmission, you can't even tell how it's misaligning. Pull it back. You can't even see the misalignment at all. So now we got on the back side here, alright, on the back side here, there's a stud right up where my hand is. I don't know how much of the camera you can see it, but that's where that bracket's going to go, and hopefully it should go right up to the block if I could find the hole in this block that's covered in scourge. We'll see. Alright, so I got the bracket loosely on the stud on the back of the starter, and you could see it goes right up to where the dipstick is held in. So right there where the dipstick is held in is where that bracket's going to go. So I'm going to get that dipstick nut or bolt out, thread it through the bracket, and then see if I could tighten the bracket up. I'm going to loosen the starter up first, tighten that bracket up, and then maybe tighten the starter up. I don't know which way to go with it, which one to tighten up first. I'm not sure. I don't know if this is going to work, but it might hold the starter a little more rigid. Who knows? Alright, so I put the bracket up top and left it loose. And then I loosened the starter up. And usually when I loosen the starter up and drive the starter back up, it sits in the right spot the first time. So that's what I did. I loosened it up, drove it back up tight, and then I tightened the back bracket. So now I'm going to go see if it's lined up good to start, and if I could repeatedly start it a couple of times. That would be pretty good. Let's Let's see what happens. Alright, so I got the bracket in the back. I used a longer bolt because now it's got to go through the bracket for the starter and the bracket that holds the dipstick in. I got it tight to the back of the starter. I got the front tight, and I got to shim in half of it because it seems that just shimming the broken end is actually making the starter work. It seems like I could get about 3 out of it, sometimes 4, and then I got to come under and loosen and readjust again. And I think that might be because the starter gear is starting to really take a beating. So if the only other starter I have doesn't have the bolt on the back, which I can't even get to show you, but the stud on the back rather, for that back mount. So if I could get, like, you know, I'd be really happy if I could get 2 starts each time, because at least I don't have to lay on the street, you know, out when I'm working to get it to go home. If I could get there and home without having to crawl underneath and loosen and tighten the starter, I think I'd be ahead of the game. Well, the hardest part about doing this was having to climb under the truck and then out of the truck to try it, under the truck, out of the truck to try it. So I think we're okay for the short term as long as it's not raining. I think, like I said earlier, I'll be happy if I could get 2 starts each time I loosen and tighten the starter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring every day with me a cordless impact and a small pry bar, because what happens is the starter gear sometimes gets stuck. It shoots out and gets stuck. So if I can use this to either get that starter gear back or just to pry the flywheel a little bit, just get a little movement in it and unstick the starter gear, a lot of times I could bump it and it'll start. It actually starts really easy. I just need a halfway decent crank and it starts up. So that is good. Anyway, so now what do we do about this? Well, they make a kit, and this kit was designed to retrofit early engines with late model transmissions. Just the early Chevy engines in like the 50s and the 60s, they didn't have starter mounting pads where the ears crack off. They had a 3-bolt starter that bolted forward instead of bolting up to the engine, and that they bolted to the cast iron bell housings of the transmission. And they make this plate so that you can adapt a later model transmission to an early engine that doesn't have a mounting tab for the starter, and that late model transmission doesn't have a provision for the starter mounting. So what do? Well, it's a plate that goes in between the transmission and the engine, spaces it out about 1/4 of an inch. It comes with spacers for your torque converter bolts, so they're spaced out 1/4 of an inch, and now you can mount an old 3-bolt Chevy style starter with a engine without using that mounting pad and a late model transmission. Well, late model is 85, 30 something years old already, but that's considered late model. So I'll put a picture of that up here. And that's the kit that we have on order, and it's going to take a couple weeks to get it. Hopefully I could get by band-aiding this and get a few days of work in each week until that kit comes in, and then we're going to have to get that transmission. We're going to have to slide the transmission back probably a 1/2 inch. Got to get it off the dowels, slide this plate in up onto the dowels, then slide the transmission back in, sandwich it in place, rebolt the torque converter up, and then put one of those other types of starters in, and we'll take you along on that journey when that part comes in. But the Band-Aid fix is in on this one. If you have a small block Chevy with a broken starter mounting surface or mounting tab, let me know what you did, because I'd really be interested. This is the first time I've run into this in all the years that I've been futzing with small and big block Chevys, and never had a mounting tab break on me, and it's been a nightmare so far. That's it today from Axel's Garage. I'm hot, I'm sweaty, I'm exhausted from crawling back in and out from under the truck. It's a pain in the ass. Thanks for watching.